like to welcome you to BeMoreNews.com. The one and only Soledad O'Brien, how are you?
I'm fabulous, thank you.
Good, in Baltimore, signing a book or some sort?
Yeah, I wrote a book, wrote a memoir, and I had a great opportunity to come today and sign it. But you know, I have to say, I come to Baltimore a lot. My brother lives here, and I spend a lot of time with his family. So people say, welcome back. It's like, I'm here all the time. You don't need to welcome me back.
What's been on your radar? Women, Latino, the black population?
We're doing a documentary that will air on Sunday, and then again next Saturday, called Unwelcome, the Muslims Next Door, which is a look at a fierce debate that happened in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, when Muslims there, in a community with 140 churches and one mosque, the mosque decided to expand. And after that, basically, fighting and court battles ensued, and so we're telling that story. And then also I just came back from Japan, where we've obviously been following what's been happening there in the wake of the earthquake and the tsunami. You know, they've had 700 plus aftershocks.
Were you at all afraid?
Yeah, you know what, I was really afraid of the aftershocks. I don't like aftershocks, but I know that in Tokyo especially, and most of Japan, their architecture and their structural engineering is so good. So, you know, like when you're in Haiti and there are aftershocks, a big aftershock, because the buildings aren't built as well, you really are literally afraid the buildings would collapse around you. In Japan, I was less worried about that, although just the feeling of an aftershock, I hate it. I hate earthquakes. I live in California. I hated earthquakes when I was in California. In terms of the nuclear reactors, I didn't really get so close to them, and I felt that we were getting decent information from our own organization that when they were keeping us very safe, so I wasn't really worried about that.
I gotta ask you, my final question will certainly share the ball with Hugh Voices and Reporters Roundtable, but when I hear women journalists, me, myself, I'm not sending any of our women reporters to the Middle East. Am I wrong?
Yeah, I think you are wrong. I think that it's an inherently dangerous job. You know, there's a guy at CNN years ago who was one of the original CNN correspondents who was trapped inside Iraq during the first Gulf War. And if you remember, CNN was reporting live from the building and the scuds were falling, and they were successfully able to bring the war to America. At one point, I think it was Colin Powell who said, you know, what we're getting now, our information is coming from CNN. Years later, he'd go back home, was making pancakes with his son one morning, realized he ran out of syrup, got in his car to go to the market to buy syrup, rounded a corner, was hit head on and died. You know, so the moral being that anything can happen. And I do think that you do everything you can to keep yourself safe, but if you're a journalist, I would be offended if someone said to me in a place that I wanted to go, well, because you're a woman, you cannot go. And I think you have to...
Even though we can't protect them?
Well, I think you have to understand the risks, but you can't protect someone from getting hit by an IED, and you can't protect someone from getting run over by a truck, and you can't protect someone from a building collapsing because it's an aftershock. I mean, if someone said, listen, don't go to Japan, it's dangerous, you stay home, I'd be pissed, honestly. Now, I make sure that I'm taking calculated risks, and there's some risks that I don't take, but, you know, I think that as long as you're educated about what the risks are, you go into it, you know, hoping for the best, but inherently these situations are dangerous. You know, I think that people who are covering, who want the news, want you to go, and you have to say, you know, Lara Logan, for example, is a great example. You know, this woman, she's in dangerous situations all the time. When she was in the Middle East, it wasn't her first experience with a dangerous situation. That woman knows about covering war more than 99.96% of the population. She's an incredibly brave woman. You know, if she wants to go on an assignment, then she should go, understanding fully the risks. The risk because she's a journalist, the risk because she's a woman, the risk because she's a human being in an inherently dangerous situation.
Do we get it when the West, i.e. Muammar Gaddafi, says we don't want journalists here?
Well, I know exactly why. I understand why they don't want journalists there. I understand why they don't want Google and Facebook and Twitter. Yeah, I totally understand why they don't want anybody there.
Women such as yourself has broke down those barriers. Dealing with women, you and Suzanne Malveaux, CNN cornerstones that people look to. You have an excerpt in the book that actually deals with long-time supposed civil rights leader here, Jesse Jackson, who said that you didn't count when it comes to race. How did that make you? You said you felt embarrassed and angry at the same time. How do you get beyond that?
He and I, well, I think you get beyond it by conversation, but you know, right after, he and I talked about it before I wrote the book, after I wrote the book. And then even we did an event together at Martin Luther King Day, and we were on a panel together and discussed it. And you know, for me, the whole point of that story was less about him and more about me. You know, that I was sort of blindsided and allowed somebody else, whoever it was, to define what they thought. You know, and he said, "Oh, I didn't even understand you." Like, he was just saying, "I didn't think you were black. I thought you were Latino." Name like Soledad. You know, that wasn't such an odd guess. my anger was more that I was thrown. And I'd like to think that as a journalist, your job is to not, do that, is to respond with, I was embarrassed that I didn't say, well, what does that mean? I could have dug into it, and now that's what I do. I get paid to say, that's an interesting point. What do you mean?
Do you
At that
think
moment,
we got
I didn't.
past that? You talked about your mom and how they met and her father in '58. Do you think we have come a long way past that situation of
Yes.
them being in Baltimore,
Yes
or do
and
we have a
no.
lot more work to do?
Yes, on both, which sounds contradictory, I know. But yeah, I think that obviously interracial couples go into restaurants all the time and enjoy a perfectly fine meal and have a great experience. So things have changed dramatically. On the other hand, I am never surprised when there's some story about race that makes headlines. And I don't think any of us are, right? I think when you read about some kid being kicked out of school because they don't live in the right neighborhood, and for me a lot of that is it's euphemisms for they're in the bad, i.e. black neighborhood, or whenever you hear about someone not getting access because someone looks at them and says, well, you're not the right color for what we, none of those things surprise me. I'm never like bowled over and shocked completely. Why? Because things haven't changed in some ways. So, but you can't deny progress, which is great. I think the real progress is in we're having these conversations. I think when people talk about America being post-racial, it's like it's one of the stupidest things I've ever heard. Really, what is it? Yesterday we weren't, but today we. That's ridiculous. It's completely ridiculous. But I do think we're having more conversations, and sometimes those conversations are painful and uncomfortable. They used to say when in the first war in Iraq, the only way home. The soldiers used to say the only way home was through Baghdad, meaning like. To get to the end, you have to go through the worst, most awful stuff. There's no other way. It's not going to be easy. And in a way, I think racial reconciliation and all of that it's sort of a metaphor, right? The only way to get through it is to kind of walk through this often icky, uncomfortable, unpleasant conversation. But if you're not willing to do that, you're not going to really get to something that has value. You're not going to really get through it. You're going to dance around the edges all the time. But if you really want to tackle it on any topic, you got to go right through it, and so I think that's a good metaphor for where we have to get to.
You've been through your own Baghdad. Now Oprah has her own network. Can we see a Soledad O'Brien network soon?
I personally guarantee you there will be no Soledad O'Brien network. I got 4 kids. I don't have time to run a network. Shoot.
Mr. O'Brien, my first question is: this is such a personal story of your own. You always tell everyone else's story.
I know. I hated it for that.
Divulge it to the
I
public.
hated that. Yes, hated that.
What compelled you? Was it family or what?
Actually what it was people were asking me a lot about my perspective because we had started doing a lot of documentaries about race and class and culture, Black in America, Latino in America. And when someone would say, well, what's your perspective? What are you anyway? Or what's your perspective? The answer was not a single line. It was kind of a conversation. And really, it was a book. It was a story about where you started and what you went through and mistakes you made and things you accomplished and how your vision changed over time. So I really wanted to answer that question, which is sort of why I wrote the book. But I really hate writing about myself, and I really don't like writing about my family. The guy who was my editor, who's fantastic, would say, I want to know more about Brad, my husband. I want to know. I'm like, no, I don't want to share anymore. It just felt like that's not my story to tell. That's his story to tell. Interviewing my parents was like pulling teeth, but on the other hand, it was fascinating. To be able to talk to them because they don't share those stories, and they shared great stories, and they're elderly, so I knew that I was getting kind of on paper something that if we didn't get it now, we'd never have that opportunity to get it. There was like, why do you want to know that stuff anyway? Well, I did want to know. So even though it was a process like having children. During the process, it's miserable. And then you pop out the kid, you're like, oh, that was all worth it. I'm really proud of what's turned out. But during the process, it sometimes feels like a slog. But it really, I'm really proud of the book. I like it. It's a very accurate reflection of the good and the bad. I didn't want to paint here's why I'm great story. It was just, this is the becoming of a journalist for somebody, who loves telling stories.
What was the gut-wrenching, most detailed, most heart detailed moment in your life to share with people that you had to step away from the keyboard and maybe even cry a little bit?
For me, it was never personal. I've been so blessed. I grew up a middle-class girl. I've had very ridiculously boring existence in a lot of ways, a lot good health, parents who love me, no drama, 4 great kids, a nice house. It's all been, so personally, I feel like I've been really lucky to just have tons of stability, and anytime there was a little challenge, I had people around me who would push me through it or pull me through it, or, you know, say you get to cry for a day, now, you know, get up and fix it, you know, fix this problem. I think for me the hardest parts have been the stories, like the tsunami, where we go into these wats, the temples where they keep the bodies, and they, you know, you go in and people want to identify their loved ones, and they pull out trays, and the trays were so big, but because there's so many kids who died, who were so small, you could fit 3 kids, like a baby and 2 little kids on a tray. You know, and you just never get used to that. Or in Haiti, when you go, you just, I remember we were driving by, and I said, oh my gosh, that truck, in my head, I said, oh gosh, that like a dump truck. That's a dump truck, look like it's full of dead body, and it was. It was piled high. It was a dump truck, so it was already this deep, then piled high with corpses and body parts. You know, and you just, your mind can't really process that. You know, as you're saying it, you're like, oh my God, that's a truck full of dead bodies. So things like that I think are sometimes hard to get used to and make sense of, and then you go on the air and you try to kind of put it in some kind of context. But I also feel very privileged because I get to be the person who they put on a plane to go tell that story. You know, I get to be, it's me and a couple of people for CNN who get to go when something breaks. I get to go. And I would, you know, so I would never trade that because it's sometimes depressing or sad or hard to deal with or you know, just miserable. I feel very grateful for it.
In the same conversation of diversity and being accepted, looking at the whole media landscape, I don't have to tell you about the different changes that's taking place in our industry. But with
And
all
yet
this
not,
change,
right?
Yeah.
I mean, it really is interesting. Like, really, literally, some huge, and yet, at the end of the day, if we were to, like, crunch the numbers across the board, Black and, you know, even just journalists of color and how much progress they've made, you'd be like, oh, huh, not that much has changed.
Oh, okay.
You know, so I think in some ways there's tremendous progress. I mean, I look around and I see people who are doing incredibly well, and myself included, who get great opportunities, who literally get to be tapped to do the important stories. And yet sometimes you look around and you're like, God, I wish there were like 8 others of me in my, you know, in my unit. And wouldn't it be great if it weren't just, you know, I probably can do 7 documentaries a year. Well, what if there were 3 of me? We could do 25 documentaries a year. What if there were 10 of me? We could, you know, churning out. And you know, the stories that I do are stories on people whose stories fly under the radar. So often that's people of color, but often it's women in the military or minors in West Virginia who are white and sometimes disenfranchised, or sometimes it's economically disadvantaged people. You know, so if there are more people like that, that's a very genuine, real story in America. It's not, it shouldn't just be 8 of them a year.
Well,
I mean, I can't do more than 8. I can't travel 9 days a
How
week.
do local people break into the national scene, like be more news, huge voices?
You know, I think it's a hard time now because the economy's bad. It's not like they're expanding. I think the economy, with a tough economy, people at this moment, and it'll change because, you know, our business has gone like this forever. But, you know, right now it's tough. It's constricting.
So what about
And yet
young-
technology has improved that you had much more access than when I started, you know, and you couldn't just take out your camera and record and, you know, a little handheld like this, right? Everybody was, well, I gotta have a giant, you know, HD whatever camera, and then we gotta take the tape and find an uplink, and, you know, so now there's much more access. I think in time we're gonna figure out how those 2 things meet so that we get more voices. To have more
It certainly led
access.
to a revolution in the
It
Middle
certainly
East.
did, right? So exactly. So I mean, if it can happen there, it can. There's no question.
What do you
it'll happen.
have to say about black students that, you know, we're in March, but in 2 months they'll be graduating and they're looking for jobs?
Well, you
so
know,
what do you have to say to those aspiring black media professionals?
but I'll tell you, you know, when I was looking for a job, when I was getting out of college, when I was looking for a job, people sat me down and said, TV news is dead. You'll never get a job in this. I mean, the exact same speech that I'm sure they're getting now, like literally, probably word for word, was 1988.
And TV news.
And people said, you know, the evening news is dead. Right, I mean, and just so, I always tell the students, I'm sure you're hearing versions of this, and you have 2 options. You can say, oh my God, I should go into something else. Or you can say, as my mother would do, thank you for your input, and go find a job. You know, there's lots of opportunity. It's just we're in transition. You know, in a way, the students have, first of all of them can edit on their Macs. They all have cameras that they're shooting on. They're all doing their own mini docs. I never did any of that. You know, and they're toting around and able to produce from stuff in their backpack. You know, we were, well, if I could talk a cameraman into shooting my stand-up, and then if I could talk someone into editing it, and then maybe I'll have a chance to mail that out. You know, I just think that there's so many opportunities.